All right, Canada. We've been hearing about this pipeline announcement all week, watching the political class debate, tease, deny, then debate again like they're trying to build hype for a Marvel movie.
And now, here we are, the big day. Prime Minister Mark Carney and Danielle Smith not only in the same headline, but the same announcement. And everyone's trying to figure out whether this is cooperation, chaos, or just the Canadian version of fine, let's talk.
Meanwhile, over in British Columbia, Premier David Eby says he practically fell out of his chair when he learned that Alberta was looped in and BC wasn't, which, to be honest, is fair. One minute you're governing a province, the next you're finding out you're not even invited to the National Energy Group chat.
Yeah, he's refreshing his messages and thinking, did I miss a call? Did someone mute me? Am I on Do Not Disturb permanently?
Well, don't worry, Eby. We've got your emotional support merch for exactly this kind of betrayal. It's Black Friday week, which means that all of our merch is 15% off until Black Friday.
Yep. Who cares? Viva la Canada, keep calm, and Carney on, the whole Canadian therapy collection of mugs, t-shirts, and sweatshirts, including our personal favorite, the Maple Mega Detector.
Grab one if you want to support this channel or annoy a Maple Mega uncle at the same time.
And today, we're breaking down what's really going on with this pipeline, because let's be honest, anytime Canada talks pipelines, people aren't really arguing about steel in the ground. They're arguing about what kind of country we're trying to build, who gets listened to, especially Indigenous nations who've already raised red flags, and whether this country can finally make decisions without steamrolling the people who actually live on the land we're talking about.
Whenever the issue of a pipeline is raised, some people hear jobs, some hear environmental nightmares, and some hear political theater. But underneath it all, people are really asking, where is this country actually going and who's driving?
So we have a quick question for you. What's the key to getting Alberta, BC, and Indigenous nations on the same page? Cooperation, leadership, or the my way or the highway approach?
Or do we just drop the whole idea and go all in on clean energy for every future project instead? Let us know your opinion in the comments. We read all of them.
So, right now, the two people getting the most airtime are Mark, Mr. Methodical, Mr. Do Your Homework Before You Talk Carney, and Danielle Smith, who tends to do the talking part first and sort out the details later.
Which makes this whole moment even more fascinating, because Danielle Smith is suddenly acting like she wants to be on Team Canada. And honestly, that's good. We love Alberta. We never wanted the province pulled into some half-baked separation fantasy. So now she's positioned herself as a central player. And that's a much healthier direction than where she was headed just a few months ago.
Alberta loves a pipeline story. Danielle Smith needs a pipeline story. And Carney, he's focused on building an economy that doesn't get strangled every time the U.S. decides to have a bad week.
And this is exactly what he campaigned on. He didn't promise fireworks. He promised a long, slow, boring-sounding thing called nation building. And then he actually started doing it.
He's already rolled out big projects from coast to coast to coast. Manitoba gets its grid strengthened, Iqaluit gets real investment in northern infrastructure, and the East Coast gets their shot at LNG and clean energy exports instead of just watching Alberta fight with Ottawa on repeat. Plus, BC gets their LNG project fast-tracked under the Major Projects Office.
It's basically been a cross-country roadshow, right? North, east, west coast. Now it's rolling into Alberta. Different region, but same idea. Pull everybody into one coherent plan instead of letting every province shout into its own echo chamber.
And that's what people actually voted for. A centrist who would calm things down, make some hard compromises, and try to turn Canada into a serious energy powerhouse without blowing up the country in the process.
So today isn't Carney suddenly caving to Alberta. It's Alberta's turn on the schedule. The big question is whether this Alberta chapter can work without throwing BC and Indigenous nations under the bus.
And that brings us to the awkward part. British Columbia sitting there watching Alberta and Ottawa talk about getting to the Pacific without BC actually in the conversation.
And let's be real here. BC has not been quiet about this. They don't want crude oil tankers hugging that northern coastline. They don't want a repeat of the Exxon Valdez. And they definitely don't want Ottawa and Alberta huddling up about routes to the Pacific, while the province that actually has the Pacific is getting updates from Twitter.
Premier David Eby has already said he wasn't consulted, and he's not playing it cool. He's annoyed because from BC's side of the table, this isn't about politics. It's about coastline, salmon, tourism, and an entire identity built around the idea that their waters aren't up for negotiation.
And on top of that, BC has that tanker moratorium on the North Coast, Bill C-48, which is basically the provincial security blanket. It says no big crude oil tankers in those narrow, ecologically sensitive waters. Alberta hates it. BC treats that tanker ban like part of its identity, and it's their line in the sand, or a way of saying that their waters, their salmon, their coastal communities are not up for any trade-offs.
And then you have the people whose land we're talking about. Coastal First Nations have already said loud and clear that pipelines to the northern coast, it'll never happen. They've been through this for decades. Court cases, public hearings, consultations that go nowhere.
Their president even went further this week and said, oil tankers are not welcome in our coastal waters. And because they're rights and title holders, not just stakeholders, they actually had the legal ground to enforce it.
So on the coast, you have BC saying no, Indigenous nations saying absolutely not, and the law saying the tanker route is blocked anyway. That's the wall Carney and Alberta are staring at.
Meanwhile, Alberta's point is pretty simple. If you can't get oil to Tidewater, you have to sell it at a huge discount, and that costs the province billions of dollars every year.
Even with TMX up and running, Alberta's still stuck. Most of that new capacity is already booked, and a lot of Canada's other routes still rely on U.S. pipelines and U.S. politics. That's why Alberta keeps pushing for more ways to get to Tidewater that don't go through someone else's backyard.
And look, Alberta's not wrong about that. A country of our size and resources should have more than one way to get energy to the world. The problem is, you can't build that route by mowing down the province and the Indigenous nations who actually control the coastline.
So, here's the tension Carney is juggling. Alberta wants export capacity, BC wants environmental safety and legal respect, Indigenous nations want their rights honored and their waters protected, and the rest of the world wants Canada to step up as a stable energy partner.
And here's the truth nobody on stage will say out loud. This only works if everybody with actual power says yes. And that's not just Ottawa and Alberta.
BC controls the coastline, the ports, the permits, the environmental assessments. If they're not in, nothing moves. It doesn't matter how many podiums Alberta and Ottawa share.
And Indigenous nations aren't the consult and ignore afterthought governments used to treat them as. They're rights and title holders, and their decisions carry real legal force, not symbolic approval.
When coastal First Nations say no, they're not offering an opinion. They're stating a legal reality. They've won in court before, and they're ready to defend their waters again.
Meanwhile, Alberta's holding the economic pressure point. They're desperate for another export route. They've got the barrels and they've got the motivation, but they don't have the shoreline.
And Ottawa? Sure, they write the laws, but laws don't build pipelines. People do, provinces do, First Nations do, and investors do. If those groups aren't aligned, this stays as a press conference, not a project.
And everyone in the energy world remembers what happened the last time someone tried to bulldoze their way to the coast. Delays, protests, court battles, ballooning costs. Nobody wants a sequel to that.
And this is the part that actually matters, because if Carney can pull this together, if he can get Alberta, BC, and Indigenous nations aligned on something, well, Canada becomes a serious energy powerhouse overnight. Not just oil, but hydrogen, LNG, critical minerals, clean energy grids, the whole future economy.
But if he gets it wrong, well, we're back to the same paralysis we've had for 20 years. Court battles, stalled projects, regional resentment, and another generation of political bickering.
That's why today's announcement matters. It's not about whether a single pipe gets built. It's about whether Canada can finally act like a country that wants to win something in the global economy, instead of arguing ourselves into another decade of gridlock.
So where do we actually go from here? Because the announcement in Calgary isn't the end. It's actually the starting gun.
The next few months are where the real battles get decided. First, everyone's watching BC to see whether Premier Eby digs in or opens the door even a little crack. If he stays in full resistance mode, this corridor doesn't move an inch.
And then there's the legal side. Coastal First Nations have been crystal clear. They'll fight a northern tanker route in every arena that they've got, politically, legally, economically. Then they're not bluffing. They've done it before and they've won before.
So any company dreaming of a quick pipeline approval today is living in a fantasy novel. The next phase is diplomacy, real diplomacy. Not shouting, not grandstanding, actual relationship building with coastal nations who have every reason to say no.
And at the same time, the upside here is enormous if Canada actually handles this right. Because Carney isn't talking about a single pipeline. He's talking about an energy corridor for the stuff that the world is begging for.
But building that backbone means doing something this country has never excelled at. It's getting provinces and nations aligned before the shovels even hit the dirt. Not after, before.
Alberta will push hard for export capacity, BC will push hard for environmental protection, and Indigenous nations will push hard for real ownership and real veto power. The question is whether Carney can thread those three pressures into one coherent plan instead of another constitutional food fight.
And honestly, this is the first time in years it feels possible. Not guaranteed, but possible. Because this time, the conversation isn't being led by someone picking winners and losers. It's being led by someone who actually believes Canada works better when everyone's in the room and nobody gets steamrolled.
Now, that doesn't mean it'll be easy. The opposite, actually. It means the next few months will determine whether today's announcement becomes a real nation-building project or another chapter in the Canadian almost book.
And this is where Carney steps into the picture, because he's not sleepwalking into this. He knows exactly how messy these fights get.
This is the guy who ran 2 central banks. He understands risk better than anyone in Ottawa. He knows you don't just wave a flag and a pipeline magically appears.
When he talks about this deal with Alberta, he's talking about something bigger than one project. He keeps using words like independence and energy superpower. It's not the political slogan way, but in the Canada needs more than one export route way.
And he's tying that vision to real rules. Tougher industrial standards, cleaner operations, stronger methane targets. If Alberta wants a new route, he's making sure that they clean up more of the mess along the way.
And through all of it, he keeps repeating the same thing. Nothing moves without BC and First Nations agreeing. Not because he's being nice, but because it's the only way anything actually gets built in this country.
The problem is, everyone's hearing something different. Alberta hears export capacity. Industry hears finally predictability. Coastal First Nations hear, here we go again. And BC hears, you promised us a tanker ban.
So whatever gets announced today isn't the finish line, it's step one. Real steel in the ground or no steel in the ground at all. It depends entirely on whether Carney can take his political handshake in Calgary and turn it into cooperation instead of all these court cases year after year.
And if you're getting deja vu, yeah, the faces are new, but the fault lines look very familiar.
So as we watch what comes out of Calgary today, remember, this isn't just about Alberta or BC or one pipeline. It's about whether Canada is finally ready to grow up and act like the energy powerhouse we keep telling the world we are.
The global demand is there, the technology is there, the talent is here. The only missing piece has always been political courage. The courage to build something big together instead of watching it collapse into regional squabbling.
I don't think today will solve everything, but if it does nudge Alberta towards cooperation and nudges Ottawa towards smarter policy and nudges the provinces and Indigenous nations towards something other than a courtroom, it's a start.
Yeah, and honestly, after the last decade, a real start feels like a miracle.
We'll see what's in the fine print once the announcement drops with our popcorn in hand. But no matter what it says, the message is already loud and clear. Canada's done talking in circles and it's time to move.
So let us know what you think. Is today the beginning of something big or another political mirage? And hey, share this with that one friend across the country who still thinks pipelines get built by magic.
All right, don't bail yet. Your next video is sitting right there waiting for you. And trust me, if you like this one, the next one is basically the sequel that we didn't know we were making.
So hit it now, join the A-Team while you're at it, and if you want the deeper dives with zero YouTube filters, subscribe to our Substack, North of the Madness. It's where we put all the stuff we can't say here without getting demonetized or yelled at by a lobbyist.
So click on the next video and come hang with us some more. And remember, we're only just getting started, Canada.
Thanks for watching, and see you tomorrow.